the concept, I'd actually started working on this script in some ways a long time ago, because there's an element in the script called the Green Man. I first wrote a script with the Green Man in it maybe 15 years ago, something like that. So I've been working it and reworking it for a long period of time. And the title just felt like the right title. And to be honest, I was just very, very surprised it had never been used before, because it's kind of such a fundamental word, you know. And it's also kind of, it's just so simple, just 3 letters and sort of declarative in some kind of way. So I was surprised it had never been used, and was sort of pleased and thought, quick, I'd better finish that script and hand it in.
And was there a bit of a sort of a pitch that you had when you had to explain the film to people? How did you talk about the concept?
No, I actually don't. I always figure the script is the pitch. I write stuff on spec. I tend not to talk about what I'm writing, partly because I've learned over the years that you talk about something and then you try and write it and you discover while you're writing it doesn't work. So I just have an idea, and it's a completely private thing for a while, then write it. And then once you've got a script, it's its own argument. It's making its own case. So I think I just wrote it and sent it off to the producers and A24, and that was it. There were conversations with a lot of people, conversations with the cast, conversations with crew, but also conversations with people who weren't specifically working on the film, friends or colleagues of one sort or another, or just people I'm in contact with for one reason or another. I kind of think, I don't think there's many obligations that one really definitely has when sort of making a story and putting it out into the world. I think you can kind of tell a story about whatever you want to tell a story about. But there's something like an obligation to be thoughtful. And so I wanted to be thoughtful, but I also wanted other people to be thoughtful. I try to think about stuff as hard as I can, really, but I also know that there's a limit, which is, you know, my own limitations about how much I can think about something and how much I can understand something or be nuanced about it. So then I bring other people in. At the end of that process, in the final 2 weeks before shooting, that conversation then really became very, very focused on the cast. And that is partly about being thoughtful, but it's also something about how I like to make films. I'm not really a kind of auteur director who's saying, do this, do that. This coffee cup has to be exactly there, and this window, you have to stand here and the light touch the side of your face, or whatever it is, or a line reading or whatever. I kind of want the cast to be very involved in an organic way in the making of the thing, and so there's lots of reasons to listen to them. There's partly to listen to what they think their character should be doing, or the way their experience feeds into the story, as in their own experience feeds into the story, but also just anyway, giving them as much latitude to work and play and explore, and then fold that into the film. As much of that as possible, to me, is just, it's a good thing, or it's how I like to work. So there's a very strange scene towards the end of the film involving a vicar who starts quoting poetry at a certain point, and the poem that he's quoting was suggested by Jessie Buckley, and that was introduced during the rehearsal process and then folded into the scene. And so it really is, it's sort of literally collaborative. I think kind of what happens is I end up, in a weird way, getting credit. People always, as a default way, credit directors for ideas, production design, or actors' performances. You always hear about directors who've elicited a performance from an actor, but it's not really me, and if anything, it's the other way around.
And was there any sort of direct address of the political, societal sort of stuff?
Yeah.
And thoughts, or
Yeah, for sure. We talked about all of that in detail, but again, this is like a set of different perspectives and people adding their voice to a conversation, and none of them particularly have primacy over the other, but in a way, then what that group of people do is make the film, and to be too specific about the voice or too specific about the intent then removes the voice of the person who's watching the film to an extent, because it becomes, this is what you should be thinking at this moment. And this film is pretty much designed to avoid doing that and to leave that in the hands of the viewer. Not as an act of cowardice, but I mean, in a way, I'd hope almost the opposite, to be kind of, to be in a conversation rather than a lecture.
And then in that conversation, what does Jessie bring to that role, and what is it you like about her as an actor?
Just a first-rate, top-class actor. Really, really smart, very open, very instinctive, very good instincts. She'll often say, let me try this, and then she'll do something which is really quite complicated and executed perfectly, and so you can trust her a lot. My favourite sequence to film, and actually probably my favourite sequence in the film, if I can say that, is there's a long extended silent sequence with no dialogue that happens in a sort of unusual place in a film, sort of just into the first third, or towards the end of the first third into the second, where Jessie Buckley's character goes on a walk through woods and it starts to rain, and she finds a tunnel and she sings us some notes that then turn into a melody which is created by an echo, and she contributes to the melody, and then she leaves the woods and she ends up playing the piano, and it goes on and on and on. In a way that I hope is unself-conscious and isn't kind of drawing attention to itself as an extended dialogueless sequence, but it just naturally unfolds, and I loved shooting that stuff. I mean, I see myself as a writer more than a director, but oddly, my favourite filming experiences tend to be scenes without dialogue, so I loved that bit.
Yeah, it's such physical performance from Jessie as well, and that woman in the center of all of it is really amazing. What was the most challenging?
It was a hard shoot, start to finish, but it got harder and harder. We ended up shooting in basically summertime, where by a sort of quirk of weather, the nights were absolutely freezing. It was actually late spring, really, or early summer. The nights were really very, very cold. We even had snow on a couple of days, but they were also very short, because obviously the nights get shorter during the summer months. And so we were trying to pack in huge shooting requirements in very brief amounts of time in the freezing cold. And I would get very worried about Rory, because he was often wearing nothing. And there's a scene at the end where you can see steam rolling off his body, which looks fantastic on film, but it wasn't fun for him to shoot. We're all dressed in, big puffer jackets and hoodies and gloves and hand warmers, and he's got nothing. So that was hard to shoot. I was very worried about Rory in that section. Well, in our big VFX sequences, there's two in particular. Really what happens is everybody on set, and I think this is particularly true with the actors, has to take a massive leap of faith, because they're doing something that objectively, when you're standing there, looks ridiculous. And Rory is doing it in a particularly vulnerable way, because he's essentially naked, and he's been doing it for hours, and he's exhausted, and he's standing there with some dodgy-looking prosthetic, thinking in the back of his mind, I'm sure, is everybody laughing, and this is actually really silly. And of course, in some ways, it is silly, and you have to sort of embrace that as well, but also give an act of faith over to those people that really arrive in post-production, which is visual effects team, that we've given them the raw material in the shoot to do what they need to do in post. And so it's a weird state when you're making it. It's hovering between, in some of those sequences, something which is really dark or really disturbing or really confrontational and kind of painful in various ways, painful, and also something that is kind of stupid. And then having the kind of faith in that other part of the team to just push through that. And then they take over, and it's interesting, a similar thing happened in a film a bunch of us made a few years ago, Ex Machina, and another one, Annihilation, where really the VFX people take on at a certain point that this film is going to fail. The whole film will fall apart unless they do their job well. And often with other departments, they can support each other and help each other out in some ways, but sometimes somebody's just exposed. In the same way as an actor is exposed in a key bit of dialogue at a certain point, like if they don't deliver it at that moment on that day, something big is going to fail. And that's the problem the VFX guys had. In Ex Machina, it was a convincing machine, and in this, it was a couple of sort of extended VFX sequences. And it must have been kind of terrifying for them, but you know, they stepped up. I hope that when people come out of the cinema, they feel that they have, in some ways, been affected or engaged with something on a visceral, internal level, not just an intellectual level, and also not in a necessarily expected way. So I think films often fall into rhythms and patterns that become almost like nursery rhymes in terms of the number of times they've been repeated or the number of times they've been stated in different forms by different films, but it's essentially the same thing. So so in other words, there'd be something different about it, and there'd be something internal about it, and something worth reflecting on later. That would be the dream. I really hope it's a film that would stay with a viewer and not just evaporate as they were walking out of the cinema.